Our theme today is Africa, the world's next global economic shaper. Mr. President, you have had a significant voice around Africa gaining significant seats at decision-making tables, not just any decision-making tables, the most important that shape our world. I want to refer to some of the comments that you made about the G20. With regard to the African Union joining, South Africa now is the only country representing Africa right now. We know the G20 has, during the next meeting, the AU will hopefully join. We have the similar issue at the UN Security Council, where Africa does not have a permanent seat. I want you to tell me about the conversations that you're having and whether you believe now is the time for the continent.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I want to start by congratulating the UAE for the success of this 10th edition of the World Government Summit that shows the resilience but also the success of the country. And I want to thank the President of the UAE, His Highness Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, but also His Highness Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, but also all of the leaders of this country for holding this very important forum. Regarding Africa, as you said, we realized that the international governance is not fair in the sense that the rules that govern the world were put in the aftermath of the Second World War, and two-thirds of the members of the United Nations were not back then independent countries. This shows that there's a lack of fairness, and Africa, sadly, is the continent that most was affected by this unfairness, because this entire continent is absent from the main organ of the United Nations, that is the Security Council, and who is tasked with security and peace in the world. We have fought for decades, and we also are fighting to change the rules of Bretton Woods institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. We also fight for the adhesion of Africa as a permanent member of the G20. This fight I have led with the African Union, but it was heard by member countries of the G20 who accepted the adhesion of Africa that will be validated in the next G20 in India. And the 5 permanent members of G20 already gave their active support to Africa. We know these 5 members. We have China, we have France, we have the United States, we have the UK. And the 5th country is, I cannot forget any of these countries. So it is France, UK, US, China, and Russia. These countries have supported, we also have other countries like the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Japan, but also European Union. We also have gathered the support of other members, and we are continuing this fight in the institutions of Bretton Woods. So Africa will become a continent that will have a main role on the international level, and we want to take part in decision-making.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. President. Because we have 10 minutes, we have to completely rush into the big topics. And I want to talk about the power access that could be changing and shifting. I think it is very well known that most of African countries chose to remain neutral with regards to the Russian war in Ukraine. And there's a lot of talk around the criticism that followed that, specifically from the West and the United States. What is your stance at this point in time around the shifts in power and where Africa is going to settle with regards to what we're seeing? Because there's a lot of concern. There's going to be global polarization. Perhaps that is already playing out.
Oui, c'est toujours le même problème. Vous
it is always the same issue. You see that the war in Ukraine has led to various positions in the world, but we always shed light on the position of Africa. What Africa wants is peace. Africa is in favor of peace, and it doesn't have to be with Russia or with Ukraine. This was our position from the beginning. We said that war is bad. We know that in the African continent because we have lived wars and we are living the consequences of wars, even if in our continent, because the war in Ukraine has disrupted the supply chain and has had effects on the price of oil and every other aspect, namely wheat and fertilizers. So our position is not to be in favor of this side of the other. It is to root for the end of this war and to work with all parties in order to rebuild a new world that is far from war. Because sadly in Africa we are leading a war against hunger, against terrorism, against climate change. I think we have enough wars that we are leading. So our struggle is the survival of Africa.
You actually met with President Putin to discuss food security, with grain exports being halted out of Ukraine. We saw the needle moving on that. You have as well been vocal on how the Russian war in Ukraine has actually exacerbated food insecurity on the continent. I want you to tell me a little bit about that conversation, because during a press conference you said that President Putin said that Russia will always support the continent. And there's a clear alliance, right, between African countries and Russia, one that is long-standing.
My talks with President Putin happened in June, so this conversation is a bit outdated. But back then it was very important for us to be very aware of the fact that this war has direct consequences on our continent. Especially when it came to grains and wheat in particular, be it the wheat that we received from Ukraine or others coming from Russia. So we wished back then that there would be some kind of way to facilitate the arrival of these grains to Africa. 1 month or 2 months later, with the Security Council of the United Nations and with Turkey, there was an agreement that was finalized in this regard. And more than that, we have worked with certain Western countries like the US or the European Union. We explained how this war has put us in trouble, and today the United States are working with the African Union in order to allow us to access the market of grains in normal conditions and not according to speculations related to war. And it is the same with the European Union that is lifting all the constraints in order to allow us to buy fertilizers and grain. This being said, we are resuming our mediation efforts. We don't have a lot of means, but we have the will to mediate in order to allow two parties to work in favor of peace, because our world needs peace. Today, we are thinking about food security, and the United States are working towards that. Africa is also committed to produce more, and we have launched the project Feed Africa, that is a project of resilience. We have mobilized $32 billion over 5 years in order to ensure self-sufficiency of Africa.
I think one of the biggest conversations, frankly, since I started my career was the overpricing of risk when it comes to the African continent, and just how much the premium that African countries have to pay when accessing capital. And this is something that hasn't moved significantly enough. What do you think needs to change in the international monetary system to actually price risk according to the realities on the ground?
Ce qui doit changer, c'est
What has to change is the perception. The perception
un endroit où le risque
Africa is not a place where risk is higher than other continents. Those who invest in Africa, those who were brave enough to invest in Africa, know that they have a return on their investments, and sometimes they have a higher return than in other countries. Ask DP World. We are here in the country of DP World. DP World is in Senegal, in my country. They have been here for more than 10 years, and they are in other African countries too, and they wanted to co-invest with the state of Senegal on a project of a port with more than $800 million, and we have other companies that are in Africa. However, what makes Africa expensive are the gradings that we get, the gradings that African countries get. So people rely more on impressions, on perceptions, and that's why they perceive Africa as risky. Because insurance become higher, so the cost of investment will become higher. Africa is paying its debts. Africa is respecting its commitments. I don't understand why we always have bad gradings. So this is our fight. Our fight is to be part of the G20, is to change the gradings of Africa, knowing that these grading agencies often don't take into consideration the evolution of reality on the continent. Sometimes we have...
Sorry, Mr. President, do you think the problem lies with the development institutions that are mispricing risk as well? Because we have seen a big shift, a big effort to create African developmental institutions that understand the continent better, they understand the metrics better, but they're not big enough in scale, right? That's the issue.
Le problème, c'est la méthode.
The problem is the method. Rarely do they come see the government. These agencies rarely see the government. Sometimes they go see the civil society, the NGO. So they hear their perceptions of the governments. And this is on this basis that gradings are made. This is not what's most important in a country. When you're grading a country, you have to see the real economy, you have to see the real potential. It is not possible to grade a country solely because we think that there is not enough democracy or because a society is not open enough or because certain countries are not okay to change their legislations in a certain way. We have to respect the sovereignty of states. We have to respect the sovereignty of Africans. We have to judge Africa on what it's doing, not on what they think Africa is doing. This is the whole problem. It is a problem of perception that is very hard to change. It is very normal. It has been decades and centuries that Africa has been suffering, and we see a lot of factors that are still hindering the leap of Africa. We have 30 million of square meters in Africa. We have 65% of this territory that could be planted and produce. We have 1,400,000,000 inhabitants in Africa. All of this is a potential that could be reaped by investors. We only need a major political will, but also a positive communication in order to make Africa a place where business can be made.
Senegal will be producing its first oil and gas this year. Fantastic, congratulations. 2.5 million barrels of reserves, correct? I want to talk about this in the context of the climate agenda, because there is a disconnect between the developmental needs of the continent. The continent, by the way, is on a very hard push to industrialize, wanting to use its natural resources, and then you have the climate issue as a big threat. How are you going to balance those two? Right? Because everyone's trying to get out of oil and gas.
Yes. Les deux sont alliables.
It is possible to combine both in a lot of harmony. I think we are there. I am very happy that Senegal will export or will produce oil and gas in the last semesters of 2023. This will clearly bring change in the country's economy. However, more than that, I think that Africa is fully committed for climate. In COP21 in Paris, we were defending this agreement, and we are working to control the rise in temperatures, and we are really deploying efforts in this regard. In Senegal, we have 31% of our energy that is renewable energy. Few countries have these results, and we don't understand that in spite of these efforts, we are being told that we have to let go of certain ambitions. 600 million.
Right, it's a global existential threat.
Oui, c'est un
And you're going
absolument.
to increase your greenhouse gas emissions.
Nous allons exploiter nos ressources naturelles pour
We are going to exploit our natural resources in order to ensure electricity for all, in order to be competitive on an economic level. But we are also producing renewable energy like solar, like water energy, and all the rest.
une transition
What I'm saying is we need a fair energetic transition, energy transition. We
donc oui, faire encore du renouvelable, mais
are still working on producing renewable energy, of course, but we are also using our natural resources.
lorsque la guerre en Ukraine sont toujours tous retournés au
After the war in Ukraine and Russia, everyone went back to coal that is the most polluting source of energy, and they went back to fuel.
nous les Africains, non, attendez le climat.
So we shouldn't be told, us Africans, to take care of the climate
C'est un jeu.
and only use renewable energy and not use our natural resources.
Vraiment pour une transition
We really are working in favor of a fair transition.
qu'on valorise aussi.
But however, we have to use our oil, our gas, like everyone has done so far.
Mr. President, there is a heavy dose of reality when energy security is threatened. I think we've seen that playing out in Europe, and there's major hypocrisy. We've all witnessed it. Your Excellency, thank you very much for your time. Always a
my
pleasure to see you.
Pleasure
Thank
too.
you, and
It's all time a pleasure.
we'll
Thank you
see
very
you again
much.
very soon.
Thank you.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us.